The U.S.-Mexico border. It's had the attention of many United States residents lately, largely because of President Donald Trump's call to build a border wall. But Smith College Professor Velma García, who grew up in South Texas and remains connected to people on both sides of the border, is calling attention to a border fence that already exists. What might the professor begin a class with these days? Here's what she said.
Probably what we would talk about immediately would be what's going on right now with the children being separated from their parents, the people who are coming from Central America asking for asylum. And I would probably say to them that this is part of a larger pattern of U.S. immigration, which is to try deterrence. That is to say people should not want to come across the border. So we've already done things like militarized and areas like San Diego and El Paso, forcing people to migrate in more dangerous areas.
And when you say we, you mean the United States
US
government under various administrations.
Exactly. It goes back even to Bill Clinton. And I would say that this latest pattern that's going on at the border of separating children from their parents is again part of that philosophy of deterrence, of trying to tell people from Central America or from Mexico, don't come here. You don't want to get involved in these dangerous situations.
And then what's the impact? Because you have some knowledge about this. You grew up in Mission, Texas. You also visit Veracruz, Mexico quite frequently. So when you're speaking with people from these regions who are either in Mexico or on the Texas side, what's the impact? What are they talking about as community members?
So people in Mexico, whether the president, the outgoing president, or the incoming president, and just people on the street are offended by a lot of the policies of the United States, offended by the border wall and President Trump talking about making it bigger, offended by the notion of separating children from their parents. I think they see themselves, Mexico sees itself definitely as an ally of the United States. And so to build a wall or to separate children from parents, to say things like Mexicans are rapists, is very offensive to the government of Mexico and to just people, people in the street and Mexicans in general.
In addition to your teachings, you're also working on a book, as I understand it, and it's looked really at the history of a border fence that we already have here in this country, which we don't hear a lot about. We hear more about the border wall that President Trump is interested in securing funding for and building. But let's talk about what you're looking at, the research that you found. So this talks about the act that was passed in '06 and built about a 700-mile fence along sections of the Texas-Mexico border in 2008. So what have you found in terms of how that fence has impacted landowners and the environment? If we could start first with landowners, that would be great.
Okay, first of all, I just want to say that we built segments of border fence, or the people there at the border call it border wall. Okay.
Even though it's a fence, but that's right, what they refer to it as.
Because in many cases, this is pedestrian fencing 18 feet high. In some places also with stadium lighting and roads so that the Border Patrol can go up and down. So what we're talking about is the 2006 Secure Fence Act, which called for, this is under President Bush, called for over 600 miles of fencing. And then I think what's even more important perhaps is the Real ID Act of 2005, which actually Congress gave the head of DHS, Homeland Security, that one person, the right to waive any law that would interfere with the construction of border barriers, as long as these barriers, whether it's fencing or vehicle barriers, as long as they enhance national security. So what has happened is that people have had these huge 18-foot walls built on their properties.
Property that they own privately.
That they own privately.
The government has just gone in and secured their own easement that you would usually work out, right? Like you would need permission from a private property owner here in the United States if the government wanted to come and build a wall through your property.
Right, and so what happened was obviously that we do have eminent domain, but in these cases, Real ID, not only does it give the power to the head of DHS to waive any law, and over 30 laws have been waived, environmental laws, also laws affecting the rights of Native Americans. And so we have, in 2008, after the 2006 law, we actually built segments of border fence or border wall in wildlife refuges, for example, in South Texas and Arizona. Landowners who did not want these walls built on their properties had them built. And I think one of the most interesting cases is the village of Garnered, Texas, which is south of my hometown, Mission, Texas. It's a very historic village, 300 people, but it's been there since the 1700s. It was founded during Spanish colonial times. And this village, the people mostly are impoverished or of modest means. They did not want this wall. It actually divided the village in half. The other problem is that the wall of the fence is not always built right on the border because of geography and because of the river and the meanders. So in this case, this village was not only cut in half, but a lot of the people now live south of the fence, south of the border wall, and north of the river, and their properties now are practically worthless because they, in order to get to the other side of the fence, they have to, in fact, travel many miles. So nobody wants these properties. This is their only source of wealth.
Why do you think that we've heard so little about this?
That's a very good question. In Texas, in the Southwest, along the border, people have complained about it a lot. And I think that's the purpose of my book, is to get people to understand the cost of building such a border barrier, that it's not, I think a lot of people in their minds, if they don't know the border, imagine a sort of desolate region where with no human population. And in fact, the border is almost 2,000 miles long. It's very different. There are areas that seem desolate, but there are other areas like the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas that I'm writing a lot about that are actually very lush, that are heavily populated, and where the border wall is actually interfering with not only people, historic villages, but also with the environment. That area of South Texas has, for example, endangered species like the ocelot, endangered plants as well. And so there are approximately 40 ocelots left. And if we can, there's already been a wall built in one wildlife refuge. If we extended the way President Trump wants to do, in fact, we may see either the extinction of this particular cat, wild cat, or in fact, problems because of interbreeding.
I want to ask you about immigrations and customs enforcement. I know this whole area of whether it's U.S. border relations or immigration has been something you've been following for a while. And I think that we often forget in this country that ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, was something that was formed in 2003. Mm-hmm. Have you thought about or spoken with people about how things have changed, how immigration has changed since 2003?
I think, well, before ICE, we did have INS, so
right.
It's a different name. But I think overall, since 2003 and after 9/11, I think there's been a lot more focus on immigration, on undocumented immigration. And in fact, what's interesting is that the number of people coming across the border has actually greatly declined, especially since 2008. In fact, the people who used to come were mostly from Mexico. That's no longer the case. In many instances now, there are more Mexicans leaving the U.S. than coming in. The issue now is Central Americans. And I think,
because of the increase in drug activity and gang activity.
Exactly.
People fleeing.
Yeah, so people who study, scholars who study migration talk about push and pull factors. And I think that here in the U.S., the federal government, as I said, has tried deterrence. It make it scary for people to come. But the problem is that you have to look at the push factors, pushing, as you said, out of Central America, countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, where people's lives are at stake. They feel that if they don't migrate, they're going to be killed there because of insecurity, of violence, and because the governments there have not been able to provide the kind of safety that they would want for their families. And so I think, in my opinion, no matter how big a wall you build or how many children you take away from their parents, they're still desperate. And so that push factor is still so strong that even the kinds of deterrence that we've been trying at the border won't necessarily be successful.
Smith College Professor Velma García, I look forward to your book and I appreciate your time. Thanks so much.